Hey folks, thanks for watching my monologue. I'd like to encourage you to visit Guns Etc. They're strong supporters of our president and the principles our country was founded upon. Guns Etc. is 10,200 square feet and it's a firearm lover's paradise. And for all your online firearms needs, just click on gunsetcetera.com. And if you like my monologues, please subscribe to our channel. Thanks. Well, welcome back, March 6th, 2020, as we conclude here with part 3, the final part of my series of monologues on the history of the conservative movement, the Republican Party. I wanted to remind what set it off. And it was the story 2 days ago that Jim Colby left the Republican Party due to quote the Arizona Republic, Donald Trump's defiant and norm-busting style. We went through the founding of the Republican Party in 1856, defiant and norm-busting as it was. Lincoln as the first nominee for president under the party, defiant and norm-busting as he was, and the history of the party through 1964, the nomination of Barry Goldwater. Now, before we think I'm taking a cannonball to a flea or making too much of a small thing, keep in mind, just as we're discussing this, Mitt Romney is in the midst of making the exact same charges about Donald Trump, as he did in 2016, then got over, evidently, in attempting to become Donald Trump's Secretary of State, and now reverting to some kind of previous position. Romney is not a credible witness. Oh, he has an important vote, and the media will uncritically quote him on wise and statesmanlike and above-it-all candor. They may even go the route of saying he's speaking truth to power. He's not. And if we agree that Ronald Reagan is the benchmark that all these wise and above-it-all people and press want to point to as the norm of cordiality and non-norm busting, they are just wrong. In fact, Romney is the least credible of witnesses here. Less credible than Jim Colby even. After all, Jim Colby at least ran on Reagan's coattails in 1984. Mitt Romney bragged he didn't vote for Ronald Reagan that year. Or one would have to presume 1980 either. Romney has even dirtier hands than that. He bragged that his father walked out of the 1964 Republican convention in defiance and protest of Barry Goldwater's extremism. His father did no such thing. But Romney invented the story that he did to brag about it. I don't know what is more weird, that or having a fake Twitter account. But at least with the former, you get an instant insight to ideology. Romney was never Goldwater and never Reagan. So what the heck point is it to give him any credibility as a Republican or conservative spokesman, leader, avatar, you name it? He took Donald Trump's money and endorsement in 2012, only to rail against him in 2016 in the harshest language of any Republican, only to then try and become his Secretary of State in 2017. This is not a man of any conviction or center whatsoever, save his own ego and personal success. But to return to defiance and norm-busting, if you want to look to Ronald Reagan as the model of what's the opposite of defiance? Obedience. If you want to look to Ronald Reagan for obedience and norm maintaining, again, you've got the wrong man, the wrong benchmark. You may even have a hostile witness, as they say in the law. So let's get to work here. Ronald Reagan switched to the GOP in 1962. In a letter to Richard Nixon, this soft-spoken, easygoing, non-table-turning-over new Republican wrote that year, quote, "Shouldn't someone tag Mr. Kennedy's bold new imaginative program with its proper age? Under the tousled, boyish haircut is still old Karl Marx, first launched a century ago. There's nothing new in the idea of a government being big brother to us. Hitler called his state socialism, and before him, it was benevolent monarchy." He spoke on behalf of Barry Goldwater in a nationally televised speech in 1964, saying, quote, "If you and I have the courage to tell our elected officials that we want our national policy based upon what we know in our hearts is morally right, we cannot buy our security, our freedom. We can't buy it from the threat of the very bomb by committing an immorality so great as saying to a billion now in slavery behind the curtain, give up your dreams of freedom, because to save our own skin, we're willing to make a deal with you as slave masters." He went on, Alexander Hamilton said, "A nation which can prefer disgrace to danger is prepared for a master and deserves one." So let's set the record straight. There's no argument over the choice between peace and war. But there is only one guaranteed way you can have peace, and you can have it in the next second. Surrender. Admittedly, he went on, there is a risk in any course we follow other than this, but every lesson in history tells us that the greater risk lies in appeasement and this is the specter our well-meaning liberal friends refuse to face, that their policy of accommodation is appeasement, and it gives no choice between peace and war, only between fight and surrender. If we continue to accommodate, continue to back and retreat, eventually we have to face the final demand, the ultimatum. And what then? When Nikita Khrushchev has told his people he knows what our answer will be, he has told them that we are retreating under the pressure of the Cold War, and someday when the time comes to deliver the final ultimatum, our surrender will be voluntary, because by the time we will have weakened from within spiritually, morally, and economically, we'll have no other choice. He believes this because from our side he has heard voices pleading for peace at any price, or better red than dead, or as one commentator put it, he would rather live on his knees than die on his feet. And therein lies the road to war, because those voices don't speak for the rest of us. You and I know and do not believe that life is so dear and peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery. If nothing in life is worth dying for, when did this begin? Just in the face of this enemy? That was Ronald Reagan in '64. That speech of Reagan's became known as the speech. That speech and Reagan's activities propelled him into the race for governor of California in 1966. But he didn't go into that race alone. He challenged in the Republican primary a former moderate mayor of San Francisco, a Republican. He, you might say, Reagan, was norm-busting, and he won bigly. In his inaugural, he opened his speech in 1967 with a national or perhaps international message, saying, quote, "Perhaps you and I have lived with this miracle too long to be properly appreciative. Freedom is a fragile thing and is never more than one generation away from extinction. It is not ours by inheritance. It must be fought for and defended constantly by each generation. For it comes only once to a people, and those who have known freedom and then lost it never knew it again." Knowing this, he continued, it is hard to explain those who even today would question the people's capacity for self-rule. Will they answer this? If no one among us is capable of governing himself, then who among us has the capacity to govern someone else? Using the temporary authority granted by the people, an increasing number lately have sought to control the means of production, as if this could be done without eventually controlling those who do the producing. Always, this is explained as necessary to the people's welfare, but the deterioration of every government begins with the decay of the principle upon which it was founded. This is as true today as it was when it was written. Government is the people's business, and every man, woman, and child becomes a shareholder with the first penny of tax paid. With all the profound wording of the Constitution, probably the most meaningful words are the first three, we, the people. Those of us here today who have been elected to constitutional office or legislative position are in a three-word phrase, we are the people, chosen by them to see that no permanent structure of government ever encroaches on freedom or assumes a power beyond that freely granted by the people. We stand between the taxpayer and the tax spender. It is inconceivable to me that anyone could accept this delegated authority without asking God's help. I pray that we who legislate and administer will be granted wisdom and strength beyond our own limited power, that with divine guidance we can avoid easy expedients as we work to build a state where liberty under law and justice can triumph, where compassion can govern, and wherein the people can participate and prosper because of their government and not in spite of it." Close quote. Of course, Reagan would never put or invoke God in politics, right? Ridiculous. As much as Lincoln, he would. What was one of Ronald Reagan's first acts then as governor after his inaugural? He took seriously his role as a member of the California Board of Regents and efforted the firing of the president of the Board of Regents, Clark Kerr, a famous liberal. Headline above the lead story in the San Francisco Chronicle the next day, January 21st, read, quote, "UC Regents fire Kerr, big victory for Reagan," close quote. And of course that was Reagan, as much as firing the Patco employees when they struck in violation of federal law in 1981 was Reagan. But let me not get ahead of myself. Remember 1976. Obedient and non-norm-busting Ronald Reagan took on the sitting incumbent Republican president of the United States, Jerry Ford, trying to oust him, and came very, very close. Was he a soft candidate against Jerry Ford? emblem of the East Coast moderate establishment Republicans? No. When he announced his campaign for president, he said this: "An effort has been made in this campaign to suggest that there aren't any real differences between Mr. Ford and myself. Well, I believe there are, and these differences are fundamental. One of them has to do with our approach to government. Before Richard Nixon appointed him vice president, Mr. Ford was a congressman for 25 years. His concern of necessity was the welfare of his congressional district. For most of his adult life, he has been part of the Washington establishment. I believe in people." Now, Mr. Ford places his faith in the Washington establishment. Reagan went on in that speech on the soft issues, like the Second Amendment. He said this, quote, "The other day, Mr. Ford came out against gun control, but back in Washington, his attorney general has proposed a 7-point program that amounts to just that, gun control. I don't think that making it difficult for law-abiding citizens to obtain guns will lower the crime rate, not when the criminals will always find a way to get them." I'll have more in just a moment. Don't go away. I'm Seth Leibsohn, and we'll be right back.